Hello, my name is Gary Blatto-Vallee, and this is my presentation for my research proposal, Relational Reasoning of Deaf College Students in Mathematics. It's a working title. I'm not settled on it yet. The purpose is to examine how and what deaf students, what their relational skills are, meaning how do they see patterns? Do they recognize them to how we think they should, or do they do recognize them? I'm going to look at deaf students of different math abilities and try to look at what the deaf students who are successful in math. And to me, that means you've taken calculus, the first course, and you've passed it. To me, that means you finished a good high school course of math or the equivalent thereof. You've come to college, you've arrived at calculus or maybe statistics, Stats 1, and you've successfully completed that course. That to me is a successful math student, minimally. And compare them, look at them compared to students who are in developmental courses, who are in the courses that I teach, who for them solving a system of equations is a new or a very difficult thing for them. A system of two equations, two unknowns. So I want to look at their relational skills and how it relates to their math ability. And part of the study will be also to replicate and extend a work I've done previously where we looked at how deaf and hard of hearing students compared to hearing students utilize visual representation in solving math problems, word problems specifically, and how that related to their success or not having success. Background, deaf students in mathematics. What brought me to this was when I started teaching mathematics, deaf students were struggling much more than I would have guessed, even though I grew up with an extended deaf family, and I've worked as an interpreter in deafness for a while, but arriving at where I work now, teaching deaf college students, I was quite alarmed, or just surprised. I was surprised. I knew, of course, we understand that reading, that language issues are part of what a deaf student's going to struggle with, which is natural, but I didn't assume mathematics. So when I started reading about it, I find that globally, deaf students lag behind their hearing peers by about 3 years. And this really does go back to language. It goes back to early childhood experience. Many deaf students, deaf children, are born to families where everybody else can hear. So they're the only person that cannot hear, and therefore their environment is not geared toward them maximizing and learning and developing as a baby, as a child, the skills that we want children to develop. One of our entering classes, a typical class, not atypical at all, 80% of our entering class who are entering associate degree programs, they scored below the 50th percentile on the ACT math subtest. And actually, I'm not on this slide, but 32% of them scored at or below chance. This is not because they're deaf. There's no correlation between degree of deafness and mathematical ability. Intervention works if you understand the things, the core skills, the foundational knowledge that a deaf student doesn't have, and you can design intervention for those students, they catch up. Now, basic numerical skill, foundational conceptual development, and children's mathematics has been an increased area of study in developmental psychology. I know DeHane put out a book, Number Sense. Dr. Bull, who I've worked with, and other people are looking at how children understand number, how numeracy happens, and we're learning that children and babies, younger and younger, do understand quantity more than we ever thought they could. We studied, Dr. Bull and the research team I was part of, we looked at a number of basic automation skills in deaf and hard of hearing people and realized that there were no differences in their reaction times. So what that means is the struggle deaf and hard of hearing learners have in math is not due to poor basic numerical knowledge. Now, foundational to math, which I have always thought was the ability to recognize patterns, to looking at how what I'm looking at, how does it relate to what I've seen before, and how can I use what I've seen before to solve what I have in front of me. And if you look at the definition here, or at least the American Association for the Management of Science, they say that mathematics is the science of patterns and relationships. Now, relational thinking in mathematics. Looking at relational skills, relational processing, relational thinking is newer in mathematics. Dr. Lee, Miller Singley, which is one name, which threw me for a loop, and Bunge. They are people looking at how relational skills affect or related to mathematical achievement. Miller Singley and Bunge say that relational reasoning is a crucial foundation that is necessary for learning mathematics. And Dr. Lee and company found that relational skill was able to predict algebraic performance more than arithmetic skill. And previously, Pressmag said pattern imagery involving relationships is the most essential role in mathematical problem solving. Now, visual, spatial, and relational thinking in deaf and hard of hearing individuals. Through the years, there's been a handful of studies that looked at how deaf people use or utilize different aspects together to solve a problem. And Anselm Pagliaro or Marshark and company, so they don't access the relationships when they're solving something that is multidimensional in nature. No one pursued it past that I've seen anyways. Deaf children, deaf adults tend toward item-specific processing rather than seeing the whole together. And then looking at visual spatial skills, deaf signers have been shown to have better three-dimensional mental rotations at creating images and accessing the visual nature of mathematics better than hearing individuals, or the visual nature of language more than hearing individuals. Now, those things exist kind of in, it's like a paradox for me, that math, to me, being a visual thing you can learn, you can look at it, you can visualize it, it should and does help you solve and access math better. And deaf students being better at that, at least previously shown, but more recent studies have said it's not so clean that way anymore. But they still underperform in mathematics. So when I started working on this, I replicated a study from Hegarty and Kezhnikov and looking at spatial relational versus pictorial imagery. They had a 15-item mathematical processing instrument, which is basically a word problem test, 15 word problems, and they gave it to a class of 30 middle school students. And they found that there was a positive correlation between the students who would solve a problem by recognizing the relational things in the problem. How far the truck is from the house. How far am I driving? Instead of the actual iconic parts of the truck or the house, if that makes sense. They found that students who were predisposed to look at the iconic nature of the problem, the actual car, the house, or whatnot, and they tended to miss the important aspects of how things related and performed poorly on their MPI. So we replicated in 2007. We found the same results. But we did a cross-sectional where we had students in middle school, students in high school, and students in college. We had deaf students and hearing students at every level. And we found the same thing, that students, deaf and hearing, who were able to access and see relationships in the problem were more accurate in solving their problems. Now, my framework and perspective. My perspective is cognitive psychology. My framework is relational reasoning. And there are 4 types: analogical reasoning, anomalies, antinomies, and then antithetical reasoning. I won't be accessing all of them in my research, but this is the theoretical framework for that, for relational reasoning. My questions. Now, how will deaf and hard of hearing students who are deemed proficient in mathematics differ from deaf and hard of hearing students who have been identified as below average on their visual, spatial, and relational processing skills? Next, what is the relationship between students' mathematics level, their visual spatial skills, relational skills, and their performance on the algebraic word problem set, the MPI? And then, to further replicate what I did before, relate all this also to their visual spatial schematic, meaning more the iconic aspect, or their visual spatial relational representations as they solve these word problems. Methodology. Now, I didn't say this earlier, but for me, this is probably my dissertation study. Given the variability in deaf people and deaf students, meaning there's different language use, English, ASL, some students have cochlear implants, some students don't. The variability in language alone is big. And then you add the variability of when they became deaf. Are there other syndromic issues? There's so much variability in the population, you have to have a large N. So I'm looking at 180 just deaf and hard of hearing students enrolled in associate and then also baccalaureate degree program, so 90 and 90. I'm going to separate them according to math ability, and these are my simple names: high math ability, low math ability. High math ability being students who have successfully passed Calculus 1, I haven't listed, but maybe Stats 1, who have finished 1 year of, or 1 semester of what we consider post-high school mathematics. Then low math ability with students who are enrolled in the courses that I teach, looking at solving linear equations, solving some quadratic equations, students who have not progressed up to pre-calculus. And since where I work, we have all the background information. We have our deaf students' ACT scores, SAT scores, their different language tests, their placement tests. I have a lot of background on each student I can access to help me and build my model for predicting math ability. Methodology. So I'm going to use the MPI that Hegarty and Kajnikov used, and I used also in 2007. I'm going to measure, of course, how many questions were answered correctly. I am going to also use what I did before with the visual, spatial, schematic, pictorial, non-visual, or note work, categorize those answers using a similar iterator. I have a rubric that we've written, and it really operationalizes it, and we were able to get 95% rater agreement on that. The newer stuff is you're looking at the visual spatial skills that I did before, and they were positively correlated with math ability and success in the math instrument, the MPI instrument. The newest is the relational skills, looking at the number sequence tasks, the function machine task, which you can see here, input and output, and then the function task, which is a two-dimensional array of geometric shapes and numbers, and asking students to surmise above, if you gave them an array, the array is listed to 25, but you'll ask them 99 would be under which shape. They have to figure out where in the array that number is and what shape it matches to. Now, this does replicate two studies earlier from Hegarty and Kesnikov, then myself in 2007 with the people I worked with, and then Lee. Excuse me. So extends all three of those and brings them together. Dr. Lee and company worked with hearing children only. Hegarty and Kesnikov worked with hearing children only. I'm bringing this into looking at with deaf students and deaf learners of mathematics. Depending on how the results come out, if I find what I think I'm going to find is that deaf students do not readily see the relationships we think they see because of a quality of growing up, a different way of communicating, a different experience in school, in their homes. We have to explicate those relationships, and nothing can be taken for granted. So that's an important thing that I think will come out of this study. The limitations would be that I'm collecting data from one university. Although we have a lot of deaf students at many levels, it's still one university. And given the variability that's in the deaf community with language, with prior schooling, with the use of hearing aids or implants, there's a lot of variability. So that's going to be a difficult thing to look at. There's a lot of noise in the data with deaf students. So those are things I'm looking at, and I really welcome and depend on a lot of feedback. So please comment away, and I thank you for your attention. Bye-bye.